It is 11 o'clock. I'd like to call the Finance Administration Committee meeting to order. At this time, we'll entertain public comment. If there's any public comment. Seeing none, entertain a motion for the consent items, the approval of the agenda and approval of the minutes.
Joe, we have public comment.
Oh. Sorry. You could just state your name and your address and you have 3 minutes.
Yep. Good morning. My name is Hadley Strang. I'm president of the Grand Haven Area Community Foundation and located at 1 South Harbor in Grand Haven. And I would just like to extend my appreciation for being invited to be part of the American Rescue Plan Act Task Force and thank Ottawa County for the recognition they put on the value of collaboration. Including representatives from different industries and sectors in the process emphasizes the importance the county puts on listening to all perspectives and ideas and how a plan can be stronger with the collective wisdom of a group. So thank you for considering the recommendations and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Patrick Sisler. I serve as Executive Director of Community Spoke in the Lakeshore Nonprofit Alliance, home address 6051 Butternut Drive, West Olive, 49460. I too will echo some of Hadley's comments. I just understanding that the ARPA framework and structure will be discussed today. Just want to show my support for the process. I think we've watched a lot of other counties go before us and kind of rush into determining how those funds are going to be spent. And I just want to commend the county for inviting a cross-sector group of individuals representing business, government, local government, county government, nonprofit, areas of expertise to help shape this process. I think there's been a lot of dialogue, a lot of really good conversations, research to come to the framework that's going to be discussed today. And I want to just echo, or I want to highlight just the value of thinking about investing in transformative work. I know there's 1,000,001 ways that these dollars can be spent, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in thinking about what are those areas of transformative change. And at least the conversations to date are around things like broadband, like affordable housing, where it's a win-win-win, that the people that live in Ottawa County benefit, businesses benefit, nonprofits, government benefit. And so I want to thank you for supporting this task force and considering the recommendations that will be shared.
Thank you, Patrick.
Good morning, Elizabeth Butler. I am the Director of Economic Development for the Grand Haven Chamber of Commerce, and our address is 1 South Harbor in Grand Haven. I'm here part of the ARPA task force as well, and I appreciate the ability to be a part of this task force. We do support the recommendations, and as an economic developer, when we get together regionally with the other economic developers, the way the ARPA funds are being used and processed in the other counties in Michigan is widely ranging. And I appreciate how Ottawa County is doing the collaborative approach and taking it slow. And yeah, so thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Anyone else?
Good morning, Ryan Kilpatrick. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Next and also a member of the ARPA Task Force. Just wanted to thank you all for appointing the task force. I think it's been an enriching experience for all of us who have had an opportunity to be involved. Really appreciated the input and advice and wisdom of the county commissioners who were members of that task force, as well as the opportunity to have dialogue with all of the other service partners and community partners who were members of the task force. So I too am here in support of the recommendations that are coming from the task force and really appreciate your time and consideration of those recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Or Ryan, I'm sorry. Anyone else? Seeing none, entertain a motion for the consent items, the approval of the agenda and the approval of the minutes.
I'll make that motion.
Or any questions, any comments, any additions? All in favor, say aye. All opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Action items, need a motion for the statement of review.
I'll make that motion.
I'll support that.
Questions, comments? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Need a motion for the fiscal services personnel request.
So moved.
Support.
Karen?
Yes, so this is a position focused on billing and we report directly to the CMH financial manager and work with the CMH leadership for the billing component. What we have found is the activity in community mental health has changed. The billing focus, we have the majority, if you step back maybe 6 months ago or 8 months ago before the CCBHC grant and some other activity, we really were focused mostly on contractual relationships to provide service. And from billing, that means what we're doing is we are processing requests for payment and aligning that with services. And the focus has changed or is beginning to change, kind of back to a model where we're providing services directly internally to consumers. And as we do that, the billing to do that, we have to set up with insurance companies. We have to credential the providers of the service that are internal. So it's really changed the financial support. So this position will help fiscal services continue to support community mental health.
Any questions for Karen? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Thank you, Karen. Need a motion for the grant agreement for Ottawa Sands.
So moved. Support.
Jason?
So thank you for everybody's time. I'm excited to be here today to present the four-way grant agreement with the Bill and B. Itema Foundation, our Ottawa County Parks Foundation, Ottawa County Parks Commission, and the Board of Commissioners. What the Bill and B. Itema Foundation has presented to pay for is the infrastructure needed to be able to build the yurt camping and the treehouse camping. So it goes into some detail there in the proposal, but it is a $2.5 million project. So what's worth pointing out, the outfitted camping, what we call the Itema Explorers Camp, it's identified in our Ottawa Sands Master Plan. The Itema family has already paid for those. So those funds are being held by our Ottawa County Parks Foundation. And when they paid for those, they knew that it would take us several years to be able to utilize grants, programs, and our millage to be able to build the infrastructure that would be needed to get to this area to develop it. So they approached us last year and we worked on this proposal. So we were really excited just before Thanksgiving when we got the call that they were going to be sending us this grant agreement. So it's a little over little under $3.5 million to do this development of all private funds. So.
Questions for Jason?
So Jason, can I,
Go ahead.
sorry. The master plan total for the master plan phase is 7.2 million. And then we have, what, probably 3.5 raised so far, is that right? Am I reading that wrong?
So which page are you?
I'm looking at page 3.
So that, what you're referencing, the 7.259. So what we did in order to present them with a $2.5 million proposal is we used the master plan and the cost estimates in there, and we extracted out the specific infrastructure that was needed. So the area in the red of that, the column on the right, the 2.5487 was what was proposed to them and was the bare minimum needed to be able to get to the outfitted camping. So the area on the left is what was originally paid for, and then, right, we have a delta. So there's parts of the master plan that we won't be able to develop yet. So
that gap is kind of like to be determined, sort of.
to be determined. So later today, right, the next agenda item is a CZM grant for our the kayak launch.
Right.
So, part of now that we have this, we'll aggressively pursue grants to be able to continue to work on, right, what else we can leverage these private dollars to continue to develop.
So like when you get the day use trailhead, we have 2.5 million in the master plan. Mine is in yellow. It's like what, 500,000 on the right-hand column. So I got a gap of about 2 million on that one.
If we were going to build the entire part of that master plan.
Right.
But what's included is we've put together a plan that we think works for the public and for the access to the park.
Okay.
And builds us back to the river. We would have river access, provide much better access to the park, improved vehicular access, and an entrance off of North Shore. Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of the gap is going to be grants to be determined, and whatever we can get going forward, we keep building out towards the master plan. Okay.
Yep. And we still, so, what I would say is look for in March, we would anticipate doing a trust fund grant for the day use area.
Sure.
And then we'll continue to kind of aggressively pursue grant options to help leverage these private dollars and the millage dollars. Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else for Jason? Thank you, Jason. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Need a motion for the coastal zone management grant application. Next.
So this is, as I mentioned just a minute ago, when we received the Itema agreement, we had a pre-existing strategy for the CZM program, but this is this is almost a slam dunk project. So we'll be able to utilize this Itema Foundation agreement, and then this will help us continue with the development there at Ottawa Sands. And
Any questions of Jason? Thank you, Jason. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Thank you, Jason. Need a motion for the COVID-19 American Rescue Plan Advisory Committee items. So moved. Support. John, do you want to start this, or Paul, or?
Yeah, Paul will come up, but just as you've heard some of the public comments today, the ARPA task force has been meeting over the last few months to determine, make recommendations to the Finance Committee and then ultimately the Board of Commissioners on the process by which the county would receive applications for funding and evaluate those applications for funding, and also try to provide some recommendations on major, what we call buckets or spending categories for this. And I think as you heard the reference, some counties are just taking their entire ARPA allotment and just spending it on county projects. we're kind of looking at a little bit wider perspective that may have some more transformational change within the county. So I'll turn it over to Paul to provide some of the details on the application process, the lenses or criteria by which we would evaluate these projects, as well as some of the major funding categories that we're taking a look at, and we can have some further discussion on that.
Thank you, John. Good morning. It's my privilege to be standing here and representing the task force and sharing with you their recommendations that they have on for the best, most impactful and needed uses of these federal dollars that have been awarded the county. And was already mentioned, and as you know, the Board of Commissioners assembled this task force with broad cross-representation of some incredible community leaders from multiple sectors: local government, higher education, economic development, nonprofit agencies, foundations. And it has been, really a great process for me to be a part of that group. And I'm thankful to have so many members of the task force here today. And I think if there's any questions that you may have as we dive into this, I'm appreciative that there's so many people here that we can talk through this. It's a very important undertaking. The first item that's in your motion are the lenses or the criteria for evaluating qualified projects. This document itself was incredibly important for the task force to have this documented and written in black and white, because it ensures that as we move forward with funding recommendations, there's a common and agreed upon framework by which we're looking at those important elements that would make a project successful and that would elevate its priority for funding. And as noted in the document, those priorities are placed on projects that not only meet the basic federal U.S. Treasury guidelines, but also those projects that demonstrate a strong community need, provide long-term transformational impact, and enhance the equitability of our services across the county. Those 6 criteria, obviously that first one is meeting the requirements of the federal government, and those requirements are extensive. And also the second is to have projects funded that address a demonstrated need and that offer that opportunity for societal changes and eliminate as best possible disparities and gaps and opportunities for underserved and unrepresented populations. Another important consideration is that those projects that would otherwise not be transformative or be activated for that transformational impact without the infusion of these ARPA dollars. And also with the funding of those projects, it's important to look at how that long-term sustainability of those initiatives. What will happen? That's a big component for the U.S. Treasury too, and these ARPA dollars is the evaluative component. Funding projects that have real transformational impact with real outcomes that we need to evaluate over time. So those are those very condensed and succinct lenses that this group is recommending that we consider projects with. The second item that is in your motion is the focus areas, or these buckets for which we're recommending, or the task force is recommending, funding should be allocated. And again, I'd like to note that the County Board of Commissioners, we assembled this esteemed group with broad cross-representation because these community leaders have a very close pulse on the needs of the community, and they understand what the constituents again, what those needs are across the county. And I will also add that I have been impressed with not only the commitment, but also the passion of the members of this task force. Because in addition to the meetings that we've been having as a full task force, there have been, I'll call them subgroups, that have been meeting in between meetings. So our economic development agencies have been meeting with the business community in between meetings to identify what those urgent needs are. Our nonprofit agencies and human service agencies have been meeting in between meetings, talking with their constituents on what is out there. What are those needs? What would be transformative? And that whole process has been outstanding over many months. And to bring us here where we are today with these 5 buckets. I'll further add that in addition, to those 5 buckets, and John and I have talked about this a while, it's been recognized during meetings, that our buckets have expanded, they've condensed, they've changed, they've refined. We've gone through a very thorough, diligent process to come up with these recommended areas of focus for these ARPA dollars. The number one I'll mention is affordable housing. This was an item that was discussed amongst all these stakeholder groups. Business community is recognizing one of their needs are affordable housing for their workforce. Our human service agencies are also talking about affordable housing. So that is a one bucket area of importance. Another bucket area, as Patrick had mentioned, is broadband. That's also one that is on everyone's radar as a need amongst our community, especially with the continued push of schools closing and going virtual. The other bucket is business stabilization. The conversations with our economic development leaders and chambers and talking with business community, there's that need for that workforce again with the housing, but also the retention and hiring. There's automation because of workforce challenges. And then there's also direct capital needs for our businesses. The other bucket, another one is the human and social service needs. Those items that are really standing out amongst the community and through the work of our partners. Just a couple examples, right? Childcare is a real immediate need, and then as well as mental health services support. So that human services bucket is broad, but there's some very important work that needs to go in there to help do some transformational impacts. And then the last bucket is an important one, and it's county operations. And that's an important bucket because as a county, as you all know, we've been at the front lines of handling this COVID. And we're also one of the lead agencies to help get us back on track out of COVID and to ensure that we're continuing to provide the necessary services to residents. And it's important to note that as this legislation was created and these dollars were awarded, it was recognized on the value of supporting counties as with these dollars as they deem fit and necessary and appropriate. And it's specifically identified as an eligible use of expenditures to support county operations as needed. So those are our 5 main buckets of recommendation. The third and last item in your motion is that process flow chart. I think you have that before you. This is a flow chart. It's general, right? There are lots of details and nuances, obviously, that go into this, but we wanted to create this document though, so that you all would have a general sense of what we're viewing as this ultimate process for identifying, selecting, and distributing funds. Starting with item number 1, we're recognizing that the most efficient and effective means by which we can connect close with those in need and start to solicit projects via these buckets is to have what we're affectionately referring to as a bucket manager, right? So a bucket manager for connecting with the business community, a bucket manager for connecting with our human and social service needs. So this step 1 is essentially for us to release a request for qualifications broadly for those entities that want to apply to be considered as our bucket manager, kind of our conduit to those in need within each of those areas. We would solicit those applications or those requests for qualifications and that will be fairly detailed. There's lots of criteria involved with serving in that role as a conduit with the county, the bucket manager, to the grantees. We get those applications in, we review them internally to make sure, obviously, that they meet all criteria and qualifications. Then step 3 would go to the ARPA committee. And as that collective committee of nearly or more than 20 individuals, we would recommend who we believe is the best choice to be our conduit to connecting closer with those in needs to solicit projects. Then we would create a contract with those bucket managers. And then that would go to step 5, and that would go to finance committee for your review and approval, and ultimately to the Board of Commissioners. Then once we have these bucket managers, that's where this activation starts to connect with those that would need and are requesting funding for those transformational projects. And this would be our marketing approach that not only we have a bucket manager that would work closely with their constituency to solicit projects and market that and pull those in, but the county as well. It's really important that we have involvement in publicizing and marketing the availability of these dollars. Biggest outreach is of utmost importance to ensure we start to pull in quality projects that meet all their criteria, and then we can sit down and assess them. As those projects come into a bucket manager, they would identify those that they believe, meet the criteria, have the biggest transformational impact, and hit the greatest areas of need within their sphere. Those recommendations then for each project that we believe would be funded would go to the ARPA committee for recommendation, then to finance, and then to the board. It's very important that we're all involved in this effort all the way down the line, from the committee to finance and to the Board of Commissioners. And then the final step is step 8. Once we do have a final approval on those projects that we believe will have that transformational impact, then staff would work with our bucket managers and the grantees to ensure all the data collection protocols are in place. And we establish that longer range evaluative effort to ensure that the investment and infusion of these dollars for those projects are resulting in that outcome-based impact that we really need. So with that, I'll take any questions or comments.
Yeah, I appreciate the presentation, Paul. Just going to talk about the buckets. Was there kind of conversation about presenting us with bucket sizes ahead of time? And if not, why not? I mean, it would seem in one sense to have a roadmap of, okay, half of that's going to go into housing, or a quarter that's going to go into housing, and just so that we kind of have an idea going forward and kind of have common ground on that discussion.
Absolutely. We talked bucket sizes a lot as a group, and it really helped us to shape what the buckets were. And as our community leaders were meeting in between meetings with their colleagues and the business communities and other nonprofits, we started to get a sense of what is that bucket size that makes the most sense. And we kept that internally up until this point, just because we don't necessarily know yet the influx of projects that could come in. And we didn't necessarily want to be pigeonholed to a certain dollar amount if some other projects materialize through our outreach and connection with partners. But I will let John speak more to what we're thinking about numbers, if that helps.
Yeah, and as Paul said, we went back and forth over this because, on the one hand, the moment you say, well, why don't we allocate X amount of dollars to this bucket, X amount of dollars to that bucket, it gets, to use Paul's phrase, pigeonholed. And we're trying to remain pretty flexible on this because we don't know yet what type of applications we'll receive. And if we receive a lot of transformational applications that are heavy in one bucket but light in another, I would think the county would want some flexibility as to how we would spend that money. The preliminary numbers that we looked at in terms of buckets, and again, we're not looking to set this in stone by any stretch of the imagination, and for the reasons I just mentioned, and I'll bring up another reason in a second. But for county operations, we had looked at a figure of $20 million, and for broadband, we looked at anywhere, from 0 to 15 million, because we want to get as much of other people's money, like Comcast's money and maybe the state's broadband ARPA money to go into this. Affordable housing, we were looking at maybe about 13.5 million. And the human service needs about 2 million and the business needs about 6.5 million. But I just, want to caution you, we want to be as flexible as we can on that. And two, the other ball in the air that we have to juggle is the fact that ARPA recognizes that communities may have lost revenue because of COVID. And so there's a formula that ARPA requires us to go through to calculate that lost revenue. And I'm sure Karen will correct me if I'm wrong, but they look at your average, if they look at your average revenue, what it was back in 2016, 17, and 18. I think they go by calendar year, actually, 16, 17, and 18. And we compare that revenue with what our revenue will be in calendar years 20, 21, and 22. So, and it's based on a formula, and the significance of lost revenue is that there are significantly fewer restrictions on how the county can spend ARPA funds that are considered lost revenue. And fiscal services had done a calculation for calendar year 2020, and I believe had our auditor take a look at it to have another set of eyes look at this. And so our calculated lost revenue for just 2020 alone, and again, we're looking at 3 years, not just one, was about $19 million. And so we're going to be shortly calculating what we think our lost revenue is for calendar year 2021. And then we'll have to project, obviously, for 2022. I do want to say that this isn't necessarily, oh my God, we lost $19 million. I mean, you've heard Karen say as part of our budget, we are holding our own financially. It's the way the revenue is calculated according to ARPA's regulations. And I won't get into the weeds of that, but one of the issues that the finance committee and ultimately the board has to consider is we formed this ARPA task force to take a look at a wide variety of needs in the county, from human service needs to business needs to county needs to broadband needs. It's quite possible that our lost revenue could be calculated for the entire $57 million allocation from ARPA. And so I think you need to know that because you could say, hey, that's lost revenue and we should have it all. And I think some counties are doing that. Or you can say, yes, it's quote unquote lost revenue in terms of how it's calculated under ARPA. But we've put in just a tentative, $20 million bucket for county stuff and put the rest of the ARPA money into those other buckets, again, tentatively. And so that's the recommendation of the ARPA task force, is not to use all of that lost revenue and just say, hey, and have the county spend it. It was to say, we will allocate some of that ARPA fund to the county bucket, but the rest would go to these other buckets. But you need to be aware that in terms of how lost revenue is calculated under the ARPA regulations, it's quite possible that it could be calculated that the entire $57 million that we're receiving in ARPA funds would be considered lost revenue. So I think you need to just know that in terms of how you make your decisions.
So when you're calculating the lost revenue, I think we've had this discussion before, Karen, that would enter into the general fund, or how would that money be allocated initially?
So for the lost revenue allocation, so there are still rules as there are with any of these grants, which that the funds can be used. So it's really to provide direct services to county residents. So that can include anything. They give examples of pay-as-you-go infrastructure, providing public safety. There's any direct support. And then there's a few items that are strictly prohibited. One being, you can't use the funds to lower your tax rate. You cannot pay debt service. So there's a few restrictions as well that the funds can be used for. But in general, they give you all kinds of examples, and then but it's intended to support county operations.
And then just a follow-up question, Paul, if I could. You didn't want to specifically talk about bucket sizes, but I think when you look at, step 1 and 2 in the request portion, how are bucket managers going to apply to managing funds if they don't know exactly how much funds they're applying for? I mean, say there's an entity that wants to apply to be a bucket manager for housing. Would they just say, we want to be the bucket manager for housing, or do we want to manage 10 million? We want to manage 20 million? We want to manage 5 million? How does that RFQ look?
That is a good question. And I think as we would talk with potential bucket managers, I think that is when this conversation on a dollar amount, like a minimum base would be. But to know that if you're going to be a bucket manager, you could maybe have this minimum dollar amount and those numbers that John gave.
I can jump in there a little bit too. So a request for qualifications, there are a lot of the subrecipient policy that the board recently passed has a lot of requirements in there for risk and familiarity with handling federal funds, the internal controls, the structure, the familiarity with the single audit. So a request for qualifications is a little different. It's based around your qualifications to provide a certain level of service. And then beyond that, you can continue to negotiate and finalize those dollars numbers. So this is not what you're generally used to with a contract. You say exactly what you're receiving, exactly what you're providing, and for how much money. So the request for qualifications is a little bit different process than securing services to do something for X number of dollars.
Yeah, Doug, I think just to follow up on that, I think when we sent out those requests for qualifications for bucket managers, we'll probably put in there some language to the effect of it's anticipated that the affordable housing bucket manager will have approximately $13.5 million in that bucket. But we'll have some language in there saying that that's not set in stone. We want to strike this balance between, hey, how much do I have to work with? Do I have $25 to work with or $100,000 to work with? But also having the flexibility to say that, wow, this need in this bucket wasn't as much as we thought it was going to be. We need a lot more over here, and not being handcuffed.
No, I
by our
understand. I
artificial
understand
number.
that the handcuff.
So I think we'll have some flexible language in that
Sure.
RFQ that will list some dollar amounts, but we'll make it clear that there's some flexibility in that.
Okay.
Paul, thank you and your team for the work you doing this. It's a lot. Thanks for explaining it so simply that we can understand. I appreciate that. I have two questions, if I may. Under business stabilization, when I heard you speak, you talked about retention. Okay, so will some of this money go to businesses to help retain people? Is that what you meant, or did I hear that wrong?
Yes, ultimately for retention. And one of the areas, Jennifer's traveling today, so she couldn't be here. She could speak better to this than I could. But a huge opportunity that's recognized in the business community, right, is retention. And also seeking, how do you do that with other funding opportunities? So they're looking at, for the business community, almost a navigator to identify, all of these other grant programs that may exist. So is there a go-to person to help navigate? And if it's retention, employment training opportunities, what does that look like? What type of programming could that be? If it's a program for retention, or if it's to seek other opportunities, how do you navigate these other complex grant programs that come through to help support the businesses? Ultimate objective is retention, right? Hiring and retention. How we do that is part of what that those projects might look like as they roll in. What is the transformational opportunity there, and what does that look like? We don't quite know, but that is a need in the business community, is that retention component.
Paul, wasn't it too, just to try to have tools available to retain business? To keep a business from leaving, or to help them so that they can attract more business or attract more employees. So it's not specifically retention of employees, it's retention of business in general.
I think as part of Paul said, we don't have all those answers. A lot of that will depend on what type of applications we get.
Right.
And then that may have ideas towards retention. And then we will look at that and compare that with the 6 lenses or criteria to evaluate whether that's a good fit for ARPA dollars or is not. So, we're not pretending we know all the answers in terms of how these applications will come in. We're relying on those applications, for example, from the business community to say, hey, here's where some of the greatest business needs are, and here's why we think it fits these six criteria. Go ahead.
My second question, follow-up question is checks and balances, okay, for these monies going out. And then maybe it's a John question or Karen question. Who's going to ride herd on this money as it goes out, as it's allocated to these different buckets? Is there checks and balances? I work in the business community every day, and I've heard a lot of stories from last year when money was allocated by the federal government to help businesses. And we had many, many businesses that needed the help. But a lot of businesses applied for the help, and they took the money, okay, with no checks and balances, and they spent money on vacations and cars and boats, and none of that stuff is accountable. And being Dutch conservative, I like accountability a little bit. So the question is, who's going to be accountable for the money that's allocated out?
Yeah, that component of accountability is obviously incredibly important to this group too. And there's multiple layers of that accountability, from the county going to a bucket manager, going to the grantee, and the reporting requirements by the US Treasury. If you're going to receive funds, the reporting requirements are very extensive, and it will be known through the RFQ process what a bucket manager needs to do. You've got to complete these reporting requirements, ultimately coming back up to us. So there'll be a contract in place between the county and a bucket manager. There's one layer of accountability. Then as projects are identified to be funded, the bucket manager, then, they're the closest to that constituency. So they need to ensure through our support that grantee has the data reporting tools that they are required to submit. And there's multiple reports that they'll need to fill out on when you expended the funds, how you expended the funds, and then long-term evaluative needs in there. So if you're going to get these dollars, there's a line of accountability to make sure that those reports happen. And our bucket managers, that's why this is an important structure for us that we created, because as a county, yes, we need to keep an eye on everything. Karen's got to look at every penny and get everything reported. If we're going to be distributing these dollars to multiple projects, that's a lot of accountability on one agency. So the bucket manager's responsibility are also to be closer with those project partners and in support or the grantees, and then with our department as well, doing the evaluative component. So that layer from the county to bucket manager to grantee flows back up for accountability and loops back with Board of Commissioners too on the outcomes and the results of these funds.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome.
And when I go to this bucket list, I see number 8, and it just seems to me that for me to make a decision, I should know number 8 before I make that decision, because you're going to collect data, do the short and long range impact. Well, we know that before, as commissioners, we got to make that decision. I mean, I need to know that before I make a
Yes.
decision. So I'm just wondering why you put 8 before you put 5, or is there somewhere on that I missed along that would be there?
Yes, so take this, and this has been refined, right? These are the general steps. But from number 7, when we get projects that are identified that we want to fund, it's going to loop back and go to ARPA for recommendation, then to finance, then to the board for approval.
Okay.
One of the criteria on the lenses that you'll notice as well, it is the, let's see, the last one, that the results can be quantified. So when we're receiving applications from projects, those are those questions that we're asking in the application. Like, what's your anticipated outcome? How can it be quantified? How will we do that? And before it would come through these layers of review from the ARPA task force all the way to you as a Board of Commissioners, only those projects that we know we can actually, it's transformational and we can quantify it, would be the ones that we're recommending be funded. Those are very important details. And without that firm validation that we can quantify those results and the grantee is willing to do that data reporting, we couldn't proceed without it, because then we'd be at risk of any issues with the Treasury.
Absolutely. Okay. Second question, timeline on this. There really is no timeline yet, is there? Because right now the state is just, they just got the first one out of the Senate. It's on the House floor. So until they start passing them bills and bringing it to the rest of us out here, our timeline is.
Yes, the timeline is the next item on the task force's agenda for tomorrow, to talk about the timeline for that bucket manager. That's probably the number one thing we can do now. How long that takes, a few months to get that in place. And then it's this process of outreach and soliciting qualified projects. We don't have the timeline pinned down, but I know we do need to move fairly expeditiously to at least get the bucket managers in place. And I know Karen has some dates that she's looking at on debt service and other items that could help to refine our timelines on how we proceed.
Well, ultimately too, the funds have to be committed or spent. I think the commitment is by 12/31 of 24. So, we obviously need to allow time for people to carry out the projects. And so if you're going to do something transformative, you'll need some time to do that. But the feds have set their deadline of 12/31 of 24 that we would have to have the funds committed. And then they've extended that you can actually finalize the spending as long as they're committed by that date. So we're kind of living with that at the ultimate deadline. And then we've got to establish our criteria and managers and projects within that time frame and complete the projects too.
Right. We did talk about timing as well, in terms of maybe some projects we do earlier in this whole timeline and some projects later, because there may be other sources of funds available that could reduce what we have to spend out of our ARPA funds. So you may for example, maybe broadband is one of them. So we may not want to hit a broadband project right on day one and then find out after we spend our money, oh, there was these other funds available. So we talked about how we might want to time some of these projects to maximize leveraging other revenue sources. So, as Paul and Karen alluded, we have to be maybe a little flexible on some of these timelines in terms of when we pull the trigger on a project.
And like business stabilization too, as far as water infrastructure, I mean, that's huge, what could come down from the state. So there's just gonna have to couple them that we just have to just put on the back burner as far as I'm concerned. So.
Yeah, because on some of those like infrastructure projects, one project alone might be more than our entire, preliminary bucket. And so we may want to then work with our partners, say, hey, are there other sources of money that we could leverage to help with this? So we're not using an entire bucket just on one project.
I know.
So.
Anyone else? Nope. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you, Paul. Need a motion for the public health personnel request.
Make that motion.
Spencer?
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I just gave this same kind of presentation to Health and Human Services. So for those of you that already heard it, I apologize in advance. But just like at a really high level, I think like our position request paperwork that we submitted there that you guys, I believe, all got a copy of, kind of explains it really well. But on kind of a higher level, just I'll highlight a few bullet points, and these are kind of in no particular order. But we've had local challenges around staffing at restaurants with labor shortages and things of that nature. And indirectly, that's led to some challenges on my team with inspections and running into inexperienced management at restaurants and understaffed establishments that are having a harder time kind of prioritizing food safety activities at their establishments. So, and that's just kind of, I guess, a qualitative analysis based on feedback I'm hearing from the food inspectors in the county. But I think we've known for a longer period of time that we were kind of operating slightly understaffed. We're always like very cautious about making proposals for new positions. But then one member of my team who just happens to be in a part-time unbenefited position currently submitted a resignation letter recently. So it wasn't something we could really super prepare for in advance, but we took this opportunity to say like, this might be an opportunity to make a small incremental increase to our team by making that a full-time position. And speaking with, human resources people too, we've kind of come to the realization that posting a part-time unbenefited position for someone with a science degree and getting like highly qualified applicants for that, again, with like unemployment rates being low and the same thing the restaurants are experiencing, we could experience here, finding it hard to find people at this point in time. So in addition to that, fully standardizing a new staff member for the food team typically takes about 6 months. It's a very, like everything we do on my team, everything is very regimented and controlled by accreditation standards and state laws and things like that. So before someone even really provides any real tangible benefit to our team, it takes about 6 months. And even then it tends to just slow us down even more when we onboard new people. But knowing that it takes that long to train someone, we wanted to get like the process started and get the full benefit of a full-time person out of all the training, because whether they're part-time or full-time, a part-time person would probably take a year to train them, to be honest, within limited hours they'd be working. So due to continued population growth in Ottawa County, a proportional amount of food is being consumed in Ottawa County. I know restaurants have had their challenges over the last year, but we had more people apply for food service licenses this past year than we ever have. So we continue to see continued growth as far as number of establishments that were required to inspect. It's never decreased. It's gone up every year. The FDA provides us with a calculation for required staffing levels based on the number of inspections that are required to be completed. Based on their formula, that it would say that we need full 8-time people doing food inspections to complete everything in a timely manner and maintain quality and everything. With this proposal, we'd have 6. So I currently have 5.5 about with the part-time person I have. So this doesn't really get us all the way there. gets us closer to meeting kind of that metric. And so, like I said, every activity that we perform has very specific deadlines. Plan reviews for new establishments that are opening have to be completed within 30 days. Routine unannounced inspections are completed every 6 months on average. Follow-up inspections for uncorrected high-risk violations have to occur within 10 days. General complaints from the public have to be responded to within 5 days. Foodborne illness complaints have to be investigated within 24 hours. So from a public health perspective, I believe these timelines are important and they matter. And then just from like a industry perspective, and I shared some feedback we've received from industry over the years related to the services we're providing and whether they find them helpful. Almost everyone finds our services we're providing helpful from the industry's perspective. So I know they depend on us to get them open quickly when they submit plans to our office. I just want to make sure that we can continue providing high-level service in that way. And then I think that's everything I wanted to say. So I don't know if there's any questions.
Questions for Spencer?
Yeah, hey Spencer.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the presentation.
yeah.
Is this gonna be enough to kind of get some of the backlog cleared or?
Yeah, I mean, my hope would be that this certainly helps us clear a backlog. It's always a challenge playing catch up and maintaining high quality service with limited resources. Again, like ideally, yeah, it'd be great to like, it came up in the other meeting, like to subcontract or onboard a part-time person to help us get caught up and then be like, we don't need that help anymore. That's just something that I'm gonna have to figure out as we go. And I just wanna, yeah, I don't know, playing catch up, like I said, is hard. We've had to do it before, you know, there's been periods of time where we're down a person, someone's out on an FMLA leave with a new child and we fall behind and we find a way to catch up. That'll be a challenge though, even with this proposal, I think, but.
From my understanding, the previous discussion is finding the frontline personnel, right? The people who, you know, qualified. Is there any way we can backfill with data folks in the background or that doesn't really come into
Yeah,
play?
not really. Yeah, no, I
Okay.
can't think of a way to do that.
Yeah,
I
okay.
put a lot of thought into this and over the years when we've been down, like in short term down and falling behind, I'm like, what can we do? What can we do? And I always come up with a loss. It's like, is there someone who's retired, who's fully trained, who's like willing to jump in and help out for a bit? And no, I always fall short there. So I know Lisa had a few things related to the specific budget. I don't know if you want to, maybe it's.
Yeah, I want to say too, aside from that, Spencer and his team do such a fantastic job of being very efficient. We did receive some extra state funding in 2020. In 2020, as you know, we were right in the middle of COVID response, as we still are. We hesitated to do anything at that point, kind of limping along. But now we're at a period where we really need to take that funding and apply it in the form of additional human resources to get us caught up. One thing that Spencer didn't mention was because food establishments are really struggling right now with staffing, our inspections take sometimes 2 or 3 times longer. And our role as a regulatory organization may be a little different than some other organizations view it. We walk into every food establishment wearing the hat that we are here to help that establishment be successful. We believe that they are part of our local economy. We want businesses to be sustainable, and we see our job as very critical to that role in our community, and we really want to be able to do a great job to follow through on a promise. So.
Any other questions? Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Discussion items, none. Second opportunity for public comment. Any public comment? Seeing none, entertain a motion to adjourn.
So.
Or all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned.